When the temperature dropped to 70 degrees Fahrenheit in the valley, one man's survival secret kept him alive. Deep in the heart of the wilderness, his ingenious invention transformed the frozen landscape into a haven of warmth. But no one knew how he did it, not until now. Before we dive into this chilling story of survival, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love discovering hidden secrets from the frontier, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode uncovers more unbelievable wilderness stories. It was a winter like no other. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill the bones but digs into the soul. The kind that stops you in your tracks and makes even the toughest mountain man reconsider his place in the world. The snow fell in relentless sheets, each flake an icy needle stitching the earth together into a blanket of white. The trees bent under the weight, their branches sagging low, while the mountain peaks themselves seemed to shudder under the unrelenting frost. Samuel Bridger had seen many winters in the Rockies, but this one was different. This was the season when the valley would hit temperatures that defied reason. A cold so intense it seemed to suck the life from the land. On the surface, it appeared as though the land would claim him too. But Samuel, always resourceful, had one last trick up his sleeve. He had built something that defied the brutal weather, a secret that, if discovered, would change the way survivalists approached winter forever. Inside his cabin, the fire crackled and popped in the hearth, but even the roaring flames couldn't seem to keep the cold at bay. The cabin, though sturdy, was still a primitive shelter, and the walls creaked and groaned in protest as the cold air seeped through every crack. Samuel had been here before, in similar situations where the winter seemed to close in from all sides, but this time there was something different. He knew he needed more than just a fire to survive. His mind turned back to a time years ago when his hands had been as rough as the logs he chopped. Back then, he had to rely on every ounce of his experienced knowledge that had come from long hours of trial and error, a lifetime spent in the wilderness. It was during those years that he had developed a quiet obsession with survival. Not just the kind that saw a man through a single storm or freezing night, but the kind that ensured he could face whatever the wilderness threw at him, day in and day out. Samuel knew the valley's temperature was about to drop again. His body had adapted to the cold over the years, but even he wasn't immune to the severe temperatures that would soon plague the area. As the evening shadows stretched across the snowy landscape, Samuel turned to the small crawlspace he had carefully crafted years ago. Hidden under the cabin floor, it was a space that most would have overlooked. But Samuel's meticulous planning had led him to construct this subterranean retreat where warmth could be preserved even as the valley plunged into the depths of winter's grip. The crawlspace was Samuel's secret, a carefully hidden refuge from the unforgiving cold. It wasn't just a hole dug into the earth, it was a testament to his ingenuity. With the cold creeping through the walls and the fire growing dim, Samuel slipped into the narrow opening beneath the floorboards. The space was barely big enough for a man to crawl, but it had been designed with purpose. It was insulated with moss and animal pelts, the kind that were often discarded but Samuel knew could hold heat far better than stone or wood. He had learned this technique after years of watching animals huddle together for warmth during the winter months. Inside, the temperature was remarkably different. The earth, though cold to the touch, provided a natural barrier against the worst of the frost. The crawlspace itself was lined with a layer of rocks, covered with a thin layer of dirt and moss. The combination of these materials trapped any heat that the fire had failed to disperse throughout the cabin. It was this simple yet effective design that would make all the difference when the temperature outside dropped to unbearable levels. For hours, Samuel sat there, his back pressed against the cool earth, as he felt the warmth slowly seep into his bones. The crawlspace, though far from comfortable, was his sanctuary. It was quiet, hidden from the world, and above all else, it was warm. As the storm howled above ground, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. A peace that only came from knowing that no matter how cold the world outside became, this small refuge would keep him safe. He had seen others lose their fight against the elements. Trappers who hadn't been able to build properly, settlers who underestimated the ferocity of the winter winds, all gone within days. But Samuel had outwitted the wilderness. He had created his own sanctuary, a place where the cold could not reach him. The warmth inside the crawlspace wasn't just a matter of physical heat. It was a victory over the very nature that sought to destroy him. And as long as that warmth held, Samuel knew he would survive. Through that long, freezing winter, Samuel's crawlspace would become more than just a refuge. It would become the legacy of a man who had understood the value of preparation, the worth of innovation, and the true meaning of survival. The storm had been raging for days, and Samuel could hear it battering against the cabin's sturdy walls, a constant reminder of the chaos outside. But inside, the crawlspace had brought him a comfort he hadn't realized he needed. The temperature was mild here, and for a brief moment, he could almost forget about the danger that loomed just beyond the door. The fire crackled above, its warmth a stark contrast to the relentless chill outside, but it was never enough, not when the valley plunged into the kind of cold that could freeze a man's soul. It was during these moments of false comfort that the true danger began to reveal itself. The bear tracks had started showing up around his cabin the day after the first storm. At first, he thought it was just another grizzly passing through, as they often did during the winter months, searching for food. But something was different this time. The tracks were deeper, the prints larger, as though the animal had grown desperate or more determined. He'd seen this before. This wasn't just a bear looking for food. It was a bear that was willing to fight for it. Samuel had been cautious, never leaving the cabin at night, knowing that the wild could turn on him in an instant. The last thing he wanted was a grizzly outside his door. He could feel the weight of his isolation pressing in on him. His food supplies were low, and though he had a cache of dried meats, he knew he couldn't rely on that alone. If the bear was determined enough, it would find a way inside the cabin. The nights grew longer, and Samuel kept his rifle close by, ever watchful, but the bear didn't make its move. It circled the cabin during the day, testing the ground, sniffing the air. There was a shift in the atmosphere, the kind of stillness that only arrived just before a predator struck. He knew this, and so he waited, quietly studying the storm outside, trying to feel for any change in the wind or the ground. It was a quiet battle of nerves. His cabin, though strong, was still vulnerable. The fire was his only defense against the bitter cold that would invade if he dared leave it. But the bear, relentless in its pursuit, was a more pressing threat. He had built the crawlspace with the intention of keeping the cold at bay, but now it seemed it would be his only true refuge. For the first time, the thought of abandoning the cabin, of retreating into the mountains, seemed like a safer choice. Yet that wasn't the life Samuel had chosen. He had survived countless winters, learned to adapt, and built a life from the land. He wouldn't run now. Hours passed in that silent tension. He could hear the distant calls of wolves and the rustling of the snow as the storm reached its peak, but it wasn't until the next morning that the real danger showed itself. He rose early to find the tracks had come closer, almost to the doorstep. The bear was testing its limits, trying to push against the cabin, looking for weaknesses. There was no turning back now. By morning, the bear's scent was thick in the air, its presence unmistakable. Samuel stood at the door of his cabin, rifle in hand, his breath misting in the frigid air. He knew he had to act fast. The bear had become bold, too confident in its search for food. This wasn't just an animal seeking shelter or food. It was a predator testing the walls of his world, and those walls would either hold or crumble. He had spent the last few days reinforcing his door and windows, ensuring the thick wooden slats were as secure as possible. But there was a reason mountain men like Samuel didn't just rely on a single solution. His cabin was well fortified, but he had learned through bitter experience that when the wilderness threw its worst at you, the best defense was always redundancy. The crawlspace wasn't just a secret retreat from the cold, it was a contingency. And today, it was the only thing standing between him and an overwhelming force of nature. The bear circled the cabin again, sniffing at the walls and testing the doorframe with its claws. Samuel's pulse quickened. He knew he had little time before it would grow frustrated and attempt to break through. It wasn't uncommon for bears to attack cabins when food was scarce. He had witnessed it before in other mountain men's camps. But Samuel wasn't like the others. His mind was sharp, focused. This wasn't a simple fight for survival. It was a test of his own ability to adapt, to outsmart the wilderness. With the rifle steady in his hands, he kept an eye on the bear through the window. The grizzly was large. its fur matted from the snow, its eyes filled with hunger and desperation. It was clear that the bear had no intention of backing down. As it scratched at the door, Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before it would break through. His plan was simple but risky. Get to the crawlspace and wait it out. The cold wind howled outside, and snow pelted against the windows. Samuel moved quickly, slipping through the narrow opening into the crawlspace below. His breath came in shallow gasps as he knelt on the cold, damp ground, the faint smell of earth and moss filling his senses. The world above him was dark, the fire from the hearth above flickering faintly in the distance. He felt a momentary calm, but the storm still raged. Upstairs, the bear continued its assault. Samuel could hear the sharp scrape of claws against wood, the low growl as it tested every weak point. The minutes stretched into eternity. He knew he had to remain calm, keep his mind sharp. Every sound, every creak of the cabin's walls could signal a breakthrough. Then, a loud crash. The door had given way. Samuel's heart raced, but he stayed still. He knew this cabin, and he knew the crawlspace would protect him at least for now. The bear might have breached the door, but the real strength of his design lay in the earth beneath him. As the bear's roars filled the cabin above, Samuel held his breath, waiting for the next move. And as the moments stretched on, it became clear. His secret was holding. The wilderness had tested him. Now it was time for Samuel to prove that he had outwitted it. The bear's growls echoed in the cabin above, a reminder of how close the beast was. Samuel could feel the vibrations of the grizzly's paws slamming against the door, each thud a warning, each scrape of claws on wood a reminder of the imminent danger. His heart pounded in his chest, the tension palpable in the cold, still air of the crawlspace. It would have been easy to panic, to rush upstairs and confront the beast, but Samuel wasn't like most men. He wasn't driven by adrenaline, but by calm calculation and survival instincts honed over years of being one with the wilderness. Above him, the bear continued its assault. It wasn't long before the sound of splintering wood echoed through the cabin, the door giving way to the bear's raw strength. But Samuel remained still, his breath shallow as he waited, watching through a small crack in the floorboards above. The grizzly had forced its way inside. The door, though reinforced, couldn't stand against the power of a desperate animal. Samuel's plan had always been contingent on the cabin holding out long enough for him to retreat to his crawlspace, now the last barrier between him and the beast. He knew the bear would not rest until it found food. And that was where he had an advantage. Samuel's cabin was designed to withstand more than the cold. It was built to withstand the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. As the bear rampaged through the interior, tearing apart his supplies and tossing furniture aside, Samuel's mind was already working. The crawlspace, now his sanctuary, was more than just a place to hide, it was a lifeline. The thick stone foundation beneath the cabin, combined with the insulated layer of moss and animal pelts, kept the temperature even in the most extreme conditions. This hidden space was impervious to both the cold and the grizzly's rampage above. The bear's strength, though formidable, couldn't penetrate the earth beneath Samuel, and it couldn't reach the fire that burned above, providing warmth even in the darkest moments. Still, Samuel wasn't naive. He knew that the longer the bear remained in the cabin, the more the risk of damage increased. The fire was a critical part of his survival plan, and without it, he would be exposed to the brutal cold. With every passing minute, the bear's destruction of the interior grew. But Samuel was patient. He knew that every move had to be calculated. He had spent years studying the wilderness, understanding its patterns, and learning how to anticipate its next move. This was a battle of wits, and he had every intention of outlasting the grizzly. He remained crouched in the crawlspace, his mind sharp, calculating his next move. The bear was still in the cabin, distracted by its newfound dominance. For now, Samuel was safe. But he couldn't stay hidden forever. He would have to face the creature eventually, and when the time came, he would be ready. Hours passed, but the bear did not leave. The cabin was in complete disarray, furniture overturned, supplies scattered, and the pungent smell of bear lingered in the air. The once warm and inviting space was now a ruin, and Samuel knew that the bear's destruction was only the beginning. Despite his carefully crafted refuge, his work wasn't finished. His next move had to be quick, calculated, and precise. The bear might have claimed the cabin, but Samuel wasn't ready to give up. As the storm raged outside, the temperature dropped even further. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, its icy fingers creeping into the crawlspace. But the earth beneath him remained warm, its protective barrier insulating him from the worst of the cold. Samuel knew that the cold was his greatest enemy now. Without the fire, without the heat that it provided, he would be exposed to the brutal conditions outside. In the distance, the roar of the bear's movements continued, its frustration palpable. Samuel took a deep breath, considering his options. The bear had likely tired itself out from the destruction, but there was always the chance that it would return for more. His only option now was to leave the crawlspace, but it had to be done with care. If the bear had settled in, he could slip out of his hiding place and assess the damage. If it was still prowling around, he would need to wait until the beast tired itself out. The crawlspace had been his refuge for the past several hours, but he knew it was only a temporary solution. Eventually, he would need to confront the bear. His instincts told him that it would be a fight for survival, one that would test not only his skills but his will to live. He waited for the silence to settle in an eerie calm that usually meant the bear had found something to occupy its attention. After what seemed like an eternity, Samuel finally took a chance. He moved slowly, carefully, slipping from his hiding place and peering through the floorboards above. The bear was nowhere in sight. Samuel crept up the ladder and into the main cabin. The damage was worse than he had anticipated. The fire had burned low, and his food stores were nearly destroyed. The bear had clearly been searching for anything to eat. It had found nothing but what it had torn apart. His eyes scanned the wreckage, then shifted to the pile of firewood near the hearth. It was his next move. He needed to rekindle the fire before the cold consumed him. Without the heat, he wouldn't survive another night. He gathered what he could from the scattered wood, stacking it carefully in the hearth. Outside, the storm had intensified, and snow began to fall even harder, blanketing everything in a thick layer. As he struck the flint to start the fire, Samuel knew that this was far from over. But for the first time in hours, the warmth of the flames filled the cabin. He had survived the night. The grizzly may have breached his cabin, but Samuel had outlasted it. And in that, he found a quiet triumph. Now, with the fire burning once again, he would have time to regroup. The storm was far from over, and the wilderness still held many dangers, but Samuel had survived it all before. This was just another test, and Samuel was ready. The fire crackled and popped, sending light dancing across the cabin's walls. Samuel sat by the hearth, his hands calloused and raw from the work of survival, but there was a deep weariness in his eyes. The bear had done its damage, but in the wake of its destruction, Samuel had rebuilt his defenses, rekindling the fire and securing his supplies. The warmth in the cabin was now a shield against the relentless cold outside, yet despite the comfort, a gnawing sense of unease lingered. The storm outside had not let up, its fury reflected in the howling wind that rattled the cabin's fragile walls. Samuel knew that the worst of the weather was still to come. He had lived through many storms in these mountains, but this one felt different. The snow fell in thick layers, covering the landscape with an unbroken white sheet that made it nearly impossible to see beyond the edge of the cabin. The world outside had vanished, swallowed whole by the snow. As Samuel sat in the quiet warmth of his cabin, he began to hear the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood. His pulse quickened. The bear had returned. It was a different sound this time, not as aggressive, but still filled with purpose. The animal was testing the cabin again, its movements methodical, slow. Samuel's instincts kicked in. The bear was not merely searching for food now, it was looking for another way in. The bear's intelligence, once again, had proven itself. It knew that the door had been breached before, and it was likely circling the cabin, trying to find a new weak point. Samuel grabbed his rifle and carefully moved toward the window. He peered out into the blinding storm, but the bear was too close, hiding in the whiteout. The only indication of its presence was the slow, rhythmic sound of its movements outside. The bear was circling the cabin once again, just out of view but never far enough to feel comfortable. Samuel's thoughts raced. He had no intention of letting the animal tear his cabin apart again. He knew the structure of his refuge better than anyone. The door had held, but only because the bear had been too focused on breaking through the entryway. If the bear found another vulnerable spot, the cabin could be breached once more. Samuel needed to act fast. He slipped out of the cabin's small back door, careful not to disturb the bear's route. The world outside was a blur of white. The snow was deep, and the storm made every step a struggle. But Samuel had spent a lifetime navigating these mountains, and the bitter cold no longer held the same terror it once did. The cabin needed reinforcements. This time, he would fortify it for good. As he trekked out into the blizzard, his mind worked quickly, his survival instincts sharper than ever. The bear was a force of nature, relentless and strong. But Samuel was determined. He would adapt, as he always had. He would survive. Samuel worked quickly, despite the storm's fury. Each step he took seemed to disappear almost as soon as it was made, the snow swallowing his footprints. But Samuel wasn't worried about the storm. The wilderness had its ways, but so did he. He knew how to adapt, to use the environment to his advantage. He moved toward a small stand of evergreens, their dense branches laden with heavy snow. These trees had been growing in the sheltered hollows for years, their trunks thick and strong, perfect for reinforcing his cabin. He had no time to waste. The bear was out there, circling, waiting, and Samuel knew that the longer he took, the closer it would get. He needed to work fast. With his axe in hand, Samuel chopped through the snow-laden branches, using the evergreens for shelter as he cut through the thick trunks. The snow was deeper here, and the wind howled around him. But he was used to this. He had been through far worse. With every blow of the axe, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He wasn't just cutting wood, he was preparing for the fight of his life. As he gathered the thickest branches and trunks, Samuel thought back to his earlier days, when he had lived alone in these mountains. Back then, the dangers had been simpler. It was the cold, the wild animals, the occasional storm. But now, there was a new challenge, a new threat, the bear. It wasn't just a wild creature trying to survive, it was an unstoppable force, testing his resilience. And that was something Samuel could not allow. The wilderness could test him all it wanted, but he would not back down. Not now. With the branches gathered, Samuel moved quickly back to the cabin, his heart racing. The bear was still circling, its low growls reverberating through the cabin's walls. He knew it was just a matter of time before the bear would make its move again, and he needed to be ready. Inside, he worked tirelessly, reinforcing the door with the heavy branches he had cut. He used the iron brackets he had brought from Street Lewis, driving them deep into the wood with his hammer. He needed to make sure the cabin's weakest point was as fortified as possible. The last thing he wanted was for the bear to break through again. Hours passed, but Samuel didn't stop. Every movement was deliberate, calculated. His hands bled from the cold and the work, but he didn't notice the pain. He was too focused on one thing, survival. And when the storm outside finally began to ease, Samuel knew that he had done everything he could. The bear would try again, but this time it would be different. The cabin had been fortified. His fortress was ready. As he stepped back to survey his work, Samuel's chest swelled with pride. The storm had passed, the worst was over, but the battle wasn't yet won. The bear would return, but Samuel was prepared. And this time, he would be the one to outlast the wilderness. The storm had finally begun to clear, but the silence it left behind was unsettling. Samuel stood at the window of his cabin, looking out over the snow-covered wilderness, his eyes scanning for movement. The air was still. But that didn't mean the danger was over. The bear had tested his cabin once, and now it was only a matter of time before it would return, more determined than ever. Samuel knew the creature wouldn't give up so easily. Bears were relentless, driven by instinct and hunger. But Samuel had something the bear didn't: preparation, foresight, and a deep understanding of the wilderness. He had learned from the attack, adapted, and fortified his cabin to withstand the coming storm, both literal and metaphorical. The night had fallen, and with it, a bone-chilling quiet had settled over the valley. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, but Samuel's mind was far from at ease. He had worked tirelessly over the past few days to make his cabin a fortress, reinforcing the door with thick branches and securing the windows with iron bars. He knew the bear would test every weakness, so he had built none into his home. The grizzly's return came just as he had anticipated. It wasn't long before Samuel heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the logs. The bear had arrived, circling the cabin again, just as it had done before. But this time, it wasn't just a casual pass. The bear was desperate, agitated. Its growls vibrated through the walls, a sound that filled Samuel with a cold realization. It was time. He grabbed his rifle and silently moved to the door. The bear was not far. He could hear it snuffling around the cabin, testing the walls with its massive claws. Samuel stepped out into the night, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he made his way to the side of the cabin. He had no intention of confronting the bear head-on, not yet. He needed to outsmart it once again. Moving quietly, Samuel circled the cabin, staying in the shadows of the trees. He knew the bear would be drawn to the strongest scent, the fire and the warmth. He had one chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. He crept through the snow, keeping low, and found a spot where he could view the cabin without being seen. The bear was near the door, pawing at the reinforced wood, frustrated and wild. Then, in a split second, Samuel made his move. He fired a single shot into the air, the sound of the rifle cutting through the stillness of the night. The bear froze, its massive body momentarily still, before it turned and sprinted toward the source of the noise. The plan had worked. Samuel had drawn the bear's attention away from the cabin, pulling it into the wilderness where he could deal with it on his terms. He didn't need to kill the animal, not yet. He just needed to drive it away. The bear growled, thrashing through the snow, but Samuel was already backing away, making his way back to the cabin, his pulse racing. The bear had retreated for now, but Samuel knew it wouldn't be the last time it tested his defenses. For tonight, however, he had won. He had outsmarted the wilderness once again. The days following the bear's retreat were quiet, but Samuel knew better than to take the peace for granted. Winter had a way of testing a man's resolve, but Samuel had weathered worse storms. He had learned to live with the wilderness, to adapt to its challenges and take advantage of its every opportunity. The storm that had brought the bear to his door was just another chapter in a long saga of survival, a testament to his determination and ingenuity. As the snow began to melt, revealing the rugged terrain once again, Samuel stood at the door of his cabin, looking out at the mountains. The bear was gone for now, but the lessons he had learned from the encounter would stay with him forever. The true test of a mountain man wasn't just surviving the elements, but adapting to the ever-changing dangers of the wild. And Samuel had done that, time and time again. His cabin, now fully fortified, had proven itself in the face of nature's wrath. The secret crawlspace, the thick walls, the reinforced doors, each element was a piece of a larger puzzle that kept him safe. It wasn't just a cabin, it was a sanctuary, a refuge from the chaos outside. Samuel's creation had stood firm against the cold, the bear, and everything the wilderness had thrown at him. As the weeks passed, word spread among the nearby trappers and settlers. Samuel's techniques, his careful construction methods, and his innovative designs became legendary. Many came to see the cabin for themselves, marveling at its resilience. Some even asked Samuel to teach them how to build their own homes in such a way that they, too, could survive the harsh winters. Samuel, ever humble, never sought fame. He simply shared his knowledge, knowing that the wilderness could claim anyone who wasn't prepared. He had learned this lesson the hard way, and now, through his actions, he was passing it on. Years passed, and the world outside the mountains began to change. The fur trade was dying, and fewer men ventured into the wilderness to trap and hunt. But Samuel's cabin stood strong, a testament to the survival spirit of the frontier. When Samuel finally left the mountains, he did so quietly, settling in the Oregon Territory where he built a modest ranch and started a family. But his legacy, his designs, his innovations lived on, long after he had left the mountains behind. His story, a tale of ingenuity, perseverance, and survival, would echo through the generations. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, one man could make a difference. He could outlast the wilderness, and in doing so, he could leave behind something stronger than any man-made structure, a legacy of survival.